Hi, my name is Mark Crawley and welcome to Diversity Connect. Today we're going to be talking about quite an interesting and I would say topical subject in relation to ADHD coaching. I work in this community every day and I would say that this, I would suppose, conversation is often quite contentious. There's a lot of quite strong opinions on ADHD coaching, particularly certain aspects of it, and that combined, particularly in the UK, with things like access to work, it's becoming a little bit even more contentious. So today we're going to cover a few things around this, but it'd be interesting to see, what advice we can give and let you make up your own mind. But as always, we're always interested in opinions from our own community. So let's get started. So ADHD coaching, I mean, what is ADHD coaching, first of all? It's a practical hands-on approach to navigating life with a neurodivergent brain. So thinking a little bit differently, taking in information in a slightly different way. It's always important to understand that coaching can really help people with that. It's often not focused on exploring past or emotional psychological issues, but on helping you develop those real world strategies that align on your day-to-day unique way of thinking. It's also usually action orientated and goal focused, so reasonably practical, and we'll talk a little bit more about what it isn't later on, but this is very much around what it is. It's often associated with interviews or the workplace or school, but it's normally quite practical in terms of support and navigating ADHD. So the focus on practical strategies is very important here, because when we're talking about certain things like time management, motivation, etc., they can be some of the almost sort of stopping points for a lot of individuals with ADHD, particularly if you've had a recent diagnosis. You're learning a little bit more about the way your brain works, and you're learning to maybe forgive some of the things that you find challenging, but start to recognize some of the things that you find are real strengths, right? So also coaching in this instance can complement other support. So if you are having therapy or a medication, it's part of that holistic approach. And again, I like the idea of some level of coaching and support with the right person to be able to help you navigate education, work, job search, etc. But also, of course, it can be quite personalized, right? With regard to neurodiversity, it is quite individual, right? A lot of people, while there's some very common strengths and common differences, it's often very individual in terms of that combination. And then you put on the additional layer of things like co-occurrence and overlap, then it becomes even more individual. So having someone you work with on an individual basis can really help. Now, I work with a coach and have done for about 2 years now, and they've really helped me in relation to the way my brain works, etc. They're a good sounding board. They know me. They know the business that I operate on a day-to-day basis. They know some of the challenges and some of the more practical things that I sometimes might need a little bit of assistance with. So that individual, personalised approach can really help. But in terms of the specifics, and these are the key things that we tend to see most coaches helping with, things like time management, right? Particularly with ADHD, time management and time blindness can be a key challenge, right? A key obstacle, and breaking down tasks, calendars, etc. You often see there's a lot of sort of organisation apps, etc. And organisation is obviously also an area that coaches can help you with. It's fairly common for individuals with ADHD to be quite disorganized, but the flip side is, like me, I had a lot of mechanisms in place already to make sure I was organized, like diary reminders, etc. But it's just trying to sometimes declutter your life, declutter your mindset, and just try to get as organized as possible. And that can really help a lot of individuals with ADHD. Motivation and accountability can also help with goal setting and being motivated. Sometimes sort of a lot of individuals with ADHD can gravitate to things that sort of give that initial sort of rush of adrenaline, etc. And sometimes balancing that is quite important. But of course, self-confidence, there's no doubt that the ADHD community can be quite self-critical, of course, and we totally understand that. They've obviously had some people had trauma in their lives and never been fully understood, and they've obviously been quite hard on themselves for the things that they've maybe struggled with. But trying to have that sense of self-worth and almost sort of self-recognition is really important. And we've got some other great webinars around this, around self-advocacy and being kind to yourself, etc. But I think coaches can really drill into this and remind you of all of the great things you can do, where you are in your journey and those type of things. But that self-confidence is very important, and that coaching can really help that. Of course, this is often complemented sometimes by having therapy, etc. And it's important to recognize that coaching is not therapy, right? This is something where, again, it's based around these practical strategies to move you forward. In terms of getting some level of support for ADHD coaching, there is something in the UK called Access to Work, and it's a fairly contentious subject at the moment in particular, and this is being filmed in October 2025. There is something called Access to Work, or ATW, that can provide financial support for individuals that are disabled, health conditions, or neurodivergent, so to help them start or stay in a job. Helping them start is very much around the onboarding process, not actually helping you find a job. There are some elements around helping with interviews, etc., but they're very, very minimal. The eligibility, as you can see, is you must be working and over the age of 16. You do not need a formal diagnosis to apply. We've got another webinar on what you can do without having a formal diagnosis, and it's definitely worth watching. The scheme can cover a full range of support, including ADHD coaching, assistive technology, and workplace equipment, and it can provide up to 70 grand or just shy of 70 grand per year for support. Put a star on that. We'll pick up on that just at the end of this slide. And the application process, you can apply online. It's normally a subsequent phone call with a support worker to assess needs. And the scheme will then approve funding, hopefully, for tailored support. And then you'll be asked for sometimes quotes from coaching providers, etc. Now, the second 2 points here are changing and changing quite rapidly. And someone asked me the other day when I was doing a presentation around how the government was going to be able to navigate the cost associated with more diagnosis, right? So, and there's various things that I'm starting to see a little bit of penny pinching, for want of a better phrase, on. So first one is things like EHCPs, so educational healthcare plans, where children, certainly when my son was diagnosed, you get a diagnosis, you get an EHCP, and the local authority has to commit to a certain amount of funding to give you support on an annual basis. Now, it's similar with Access to Work. I spoke to someone yesterday who had an application in for Access to Work, and they was going for the renewal. It's been heavily reduced, particularly in things like virtual assistant support, in terms of coaching and those type of things. And the hourly rate for coaching has been trimmed, and the amount of hours has been trimmed. So we're starting to see a lot more pushback on Access to Work, because you can imagine they're getting a lot more applications. It's been a breaking point for a while now. It went from around 1 to 2 months to getting support to in some cases 9 months to nearly a year. And all of these things are coming together now, and you can see that the governments are trying to look at this and thinking, wow, this has gone up very, very heavily. What can we do to reduce it? Unfortunately, something like ADHD is quite misunderstood, and it seems like an easy target, right? It seems like, well, do you really need a memory organization tool? Do you really need virtual assistants? Do you really need any type of coaching? You're already in therapy, etc. So you can imagine that Access to Work is going to become quite an ongoing contentious challenge. The government will argue that they'll probably be doing things on the back end of this to try and improve employment opportunities with things like Connect to Work. Check that webinar out if you get a chance. But I would suggest that it's not moving on both sides quick enough. It's not like there's loads of career opportunities and more recognition of neurodivergent minds within the workplace. So we do need access to work, and a lot of people rely on this support. The other key thing around this, right, and this is probably less of a concern, but is important to a lot of people, is there's a lot of small businesses that are quite reliant on access to work funding. So a lot of people have set up as coaches, they've set up as given some level of support, and they rely on that funding to come through to be able to pay for their businesses, etc. as well. So we don't really focus too much on access to work in terms of funding, but a lot of organisations do. I think for me, the bigger concern is more about the fact that there's a lot of individuals out there who are not going to be able to get the support they need because of some of the trimming around access to work. So I'm sure it will settle down, but at the moment it looks like it's moving in a place which is probably not conducive to giving people the support they need. So yeah, nice little soapbox moment right in the middle of the webinar, but access to work and the combination and the overlap of ADHD coaching is quite important. But on that basis, the costs, right, and you can see obviously the costs are reasonably high. It can vary, and it can often vary around sort of a combination of things. Often it's where the funding's coming from. So for example, if access to work sign off £65, and a lot of coaches will work to that hourly rate. If they sign off £120, then obviously they're going to work to that rate. But also the amount of sessions that are booked in can sometimes bring the cost down. But the average hourly rate is around £70 to £80 per hour, I would suggest. Of course, we have monthly packages and sort of longer commitments can sometimes be more cost effective. But this is definitely an investment, and this is where I think sometimes the trimming of access to work funding can lose sight of this. If you can help support someone, they can stay into a job, they contribute obviously taxes and to the organizations, and they start to sort of move away from therapy and any other type of support, medication, etc. This can really help. This can really help the economy. So it is a good investment, I would suggest, giving people coaching. And don't forget, like if you're ADHD and you it's a fairly recent diagnosis or a fairly recent sort of self-diagnosis, then suddenly there's all these questions, right? There's all of these day-to-day things that you're just thinking, well, I've never really worked this way in the past. What do I do now? How do I move towards trying to operate in a slightly different way and trying to be as effective as possible? I think with myself, it was relatively straightforward because I've sort of recognized it while I'd set up Diversita. So I can work in different patterns. I can be more effective at certain times a day. But this isn't the same for everyone. There's still a lot of jobs and environments where you need to work within certain hours. And helping navigate that is quite important. And I would suggest that ADHD coaching can really help support that. So but the cost is not insignificant. And if you think that access to work will start to trim it, then a lot of people will be forced to try and pay it privately. I think if that starts to happen, you will see the cost go down slightly. There is a lot of coaches around, and we'll talk about that on the up and coming slides. But the cost is not insignificant. Let's put it that way. So how do you look for a good coach? Now, again, I work in this community every day and every week, and I would say there's a lot more coaches popping up, and a lot of those are coming through some level of training, right? So if you look at someone like Leanne Maskell, she has an ADHD coaching course where she trains people up. And then they receive some sort of qualification to be certified as a coach. Now, what that qualification looks like, and we'll touch on that in a second as well, it is open to interpretation. But yeah, the individuals will come away from that, and then they will often go in and present themselves as an ADHD coach. There was another course recently by the ADHD Foundation, which is unfortunately now defunct as an organisation, a charity. And again, that course was backed by a university, etc. Didn't quite work out, but the idea there was to try and make these courses, these certifications a little bit more formalized and have a little bit more support. But trying to find coaches with certifications that are recognized by the ADD Coach Academy. I don't know too much about those, but it's definitely worth checking out. The other thing is trying to get a gut feel and a good fit. I would suggest that a lot of individuals with ADHD have very good intuition and often very, very good social skills. So trying to take advantage of free consultation, normally about 30 minutes, use this time to see if you've got a good rapport and you feel comfortable. It's also worth just looking about what you need, right, from a coach. Is it the workplace? Is it sort of general sort of day-to-day practical coping mechanisms around things like sort of at home, etc. So it's just trying to work out what you need. Sort of beware of any red flags, coaches who say we will fix you, and I mean, from sort of broken to repaired in 3 months, or any phrases like this are really poor. Obviously, poor communication skills or nervousness, etc. And I think, look, I don't want to be too harsh on our community, but there's a lot of individuals that are trained up to be ADHD coaches via some of these courses that are just not. You can tell they're just not something they're comfortable with, right? It's something they want to be comfortable with. It's something they want to move towards. But it's important there that we don't have a situation where we have a group of coaches that are actually probably doing a little bit more harm than good. So beware of those red flags. Lived experience, however, can be important, right? So someone who has a similar cognitive style and there's a good rapport there, or has some good lived experience around neurodiversity, particularly ADHD, can assist. But there is a trend, right, of good marketers who build communities and then hit you with that we can fix you, or hit you with something that you suddenly got to pay for, etc. And just be quite mindful of that. I think it's really important, and I'm not trying to just put diversity on a pedestal, right? But we've always tried to make sure we step away from that. We do have very, very minimal activities that people can pay for from if you are a member of the neurodivergent community with Diversita. But it's less than like 1% of our revenue, right? Most of the things we do comes from organizations in training, etc. And we can use that money to then reinvest in our community. There's a bit of a worrying trend around coaching in particular, where I think there's a lot of people trying to make money from the community, and that's something we definitely want to be avoiding, whether they're doing it intentionally or not. But it's important. So if you've got someone, for example, who has gone through some level of training around being an ADHD coach, isn't particularly great coach, and then you're charging someone and they're probably doing more harm than good, then that's a worrying trend, right? It's a bit of scaremongering, I get that, but it's something that I do see occasionally. That said, there's some fantastic coaches. So things like good fit, things like some level of experience in the past is important. What I do like is people that are individuals that, for example, have been coaches a long time, and then they gravitate towards, okay, how can we help ADHD individuals in particular? I quite like that background because there's at least a platform of coaching experience, and that's quite important. So just something worth considering. In terms of certifications and regulations, well, this is where it does become very, very cloudy. So it's not legally regulated. And I actually can't believe that. Like, it's unbelievable that we have something where there's a group of people out there that are going out and training and coaching individuals. And there's no legal requirements for training or certification. And now, that's not to say that it's just full of bad coaches. Of course not, right? There's some fantastic coaches out there, but it does surprise me that there's very little regulation around this. So looking for voluntary certifications like the ICF or Professional Association of ADHD Coaches, there's some professional training and ethical standards associated with that, and that can only help. And of course, many coaches looking to continue developing and training themselves is important. Now, it's very individual. You might find someone who doesn't have all of these voluntary certifications or anything, but they just work for you, and that's absolutely fine. And I think this is where this initial consultation comes in. But yeah, I've got to be honest, I'm always surprised that it's unregulated. It's unregulated. I know sometimes we're not talking about therapy here, of course, when we're talking about obviously practical assistance, etc. But it does surprised me that particularly given the explosion of ADHD diagnosis in the UK, and of course this explosion of coaches, and you'll see a lot of this, that it's still not a regulated industry. So yeah, interesting to see how that develops. And the final tips, right? So look, when you're choosing a coach, right, and always feel free to DM us, and we can always give an opinion, right? I mean, I won't want you to hold it to us, right? But we can give an opinion and do a little bit of basic research around the individual and the background, etc. But the first thing is to really understand is coaching is not therapy, right? And I would suggest that when we do things like these webinars at Diversita and we have master classes and monthly meetups, they're not therapy sessions, right? They're more akin to support and coaching and just trying to give advice, right? And I think that's quite important to recognize the difference. A lot of the coaches are not in any way trained therapists, right? And that's really important to understand, And I would suggest that coaching is something that we mentioned already, performs part of a more sort of rounded approach to giving you that's giving you support, right? So it might be coaching, therapy, and medication. That's absolutely fine. But coaching is not therapy. The accountability is key, right? So people will give you tools and techniques, but it's important that there's a participation, an interest, and a commitment from your side as well, right? Because a lot of the time it will mean behavioural changes. It might mean a little bit of discomfort and trying to do something that you haven't done before, right? But it's trying to move yourself forward. And if the coach is someone that you respect and they have an opinion and they've given other people help and you get a good feel for them, then I would say trust them until they give you a reason not to. But do your research, right? Given the lack of regulation, it is essential to do your due diligence. But of course, we can help with this at Diversita. The free consultations are absolutely key. Ask about people they've helped in the past and regulations, but look at their backgrounds, right? I mean, again, I'm not trying to be too harsh, but if they were doing something totally different, and then they've done a sort of a 12-week ADHD coaching course and suddenly they want to be a coach, that might be a bit of a red flag. It may not be, right? Maybe when you meet them, you get a good feel for them, etc. And sometimes, particularly if people from corporate backgrounds, that balance can work well because they understand the practicalities of what it's like to be in a working environment, and that can really be different. So again, it's important to have this balance. But do your research, and of course, we're always happy to give you some help and assistance with that as well. So thank you for watching now, and we'll add this obviously webinar to the collection where you can comment and ask questions. As always, please add any additional comments, suggestions, and feel free to let us know. We'd love to know any of your experience with ADHD coaching, anything we've missed, anything you think, you know what, I did this bit of research and this worked for me, then let us know. Really keen to understand that. You can use the direct messaging service if you want to speak to us, of course, and particularly if you are thinking of working with a particular coach. I don't know if we will definitely know everyone, of course, but we can always just say, look, we've had a look at their website, we've had a look at their backgrounds, they've got a few testimonials, and they're affiliated to or connected to these people, etc., etc. Things like their posts as well. Look at what they're putting out on a day-to-day basis. Really important. I think, like anyone who works in this community, it's important that we all contribute very positively to the ND community without finance or remuneration being at the forefront of our mind, right? So really important to recognize that. Look at what other people do, and are they on the sort of governors? Are they working with any schools, or are they doing any free events or anything like that? But really important, I think, to make sure that anyone who works in this space takes some time to contribute to the community. So yeah, thank you so much for watching. Any questions, let us know, but look forward to seeing you in the next webinar. Thank you.
Thank you for watching. Make sure to like, comment, share, and subscribe. And scan the QR code to join the Diversita Connect community.